January 6th, 1944. The icy wind outside the 8th Air Force headquarters in England rattled the windows, but inside, the real storm was about to begin. Major General James Jimmy Doolittle stood in the office of General William Kepner, scanning the walls, not for decoration, but for meaning. His eyes settled on a framed sign hanging above the desk, a slogan every fighter pilot in Europe knew by heart. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle stared at it for a long moment, then turned to Kepner. "That sign," he said calmly, "is wrong." By sunset, the old sign had been ripped from the wall and replaced with a new one, shorter, colder, and ruthless in its clarity. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. It was more than a change in words. It was a declaration of war inside a war. In that single decision, Doolittle shattered the rules of aerial combat. He abandoned the long-standing defensive escort doctrine and unleashed American fighter pilots to hunt, to strike, to dominate. Many in the command thought he had lost his mind. Bomber crews called it suicide. Some commanders called it treason. History would call it the turning point of the air war over Europe. By the time Doolittle walked into command, the air war over Europe was on the verge of collapse. American bomber crews were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Mission after mission, formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators disappeared into German airspace. Many never returned. The breaking point had come just weeks earlier, on October 14, 1943, a day remembered in the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday. On that day, 291 B-17s were sent deep into Germany to strike the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The target was vital. Those bearings kept German tanks moving, fighters flying, and artillery turning. The bombs hit their mark, but the Luftwaffe struck harder. With no fighter escorts able to reach that far, the bombers flew alone for most of the mission, easy prey for swarms of German interceptors. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s tore into the American formation with 30mm cannons and rocket attacks so brutal that entire crews vanished in fire before they could even bail out. 60 American bombers were shot down. 600 airmen were killed or missing. The survivors limped home through clouds of smoke and frozen blood. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, wrote that night, "Greater than we are being slaughtered." The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone. We cannot go on like this. The numbers proved him right. During late 1943, the odds of surviving a 25-mission tour were barely 1 in 3. At that rate, the U.S. Army Air Forces would run out of crews long before the war was won. The Luftwaffe had mastered the math of murder in the skies. American escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning could only protect bombers for part of the journey. When they ran out of fuel and turned back, German fighters were waiting, always out of reach, always ready. If nothing changed, the air campaign over Germany would fail, and with it, the Allies' hope of invading Europe. Just when it seemed the bombing campaign might collapse, a savior arrived, sleek, fast, and deadly. It was a fighter that would change the balance of power in the skies, the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally built quickly to satisfy a British request for a new fighter, the Mustang didn't reach its full potential until engineers married its airframe with a British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, produced in the U.S. by Packard. The result was something almost mythical, an aircraft with both power and endurance. The Mustang could cruise at over 430 miles per hour and climb to more than 40,000 feet, yet still carried drop tanks that stretched its range deep into enemy territory, farther than any Allied fighter before it. For the first time, the bombers would not be alone over Germany. American pilots immediately realized what they had been given. Captain Chuck Yeager of the 357 Fighter Group, who would later break the sound barrier, described his first combat flight in a Mustang. This airplane could outclimb, outrun, and outturn anything in the sky. The P-51 gave us the one thing we'd never had before, reach. Now we could take the fight to them, but the Mustang was more than a better fighter. It was a weapon of strategy. With it, American air power gained the ability to escort bombers all the way to their targets and back, striking German fighters wherever they appeared. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the timing of battle. For the first time, the U.S. could fight on its terms. Yet even with this breakthrough, there was still a problem. The Mustangs were being used wrong. They were still chained to the old doctrine, flying close to bombers and waiting to be attacked. If anything was going to change, it would take more than new planes. It would take new thinking, and that's what Jimmy Doolittle was about to deliver. When Jimmy Doolittle arrived to take command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he brought with him a reputation that bordered on legend. He wasn't a typical general. He didn't come from a wealthy family or political background. He had been a mechanic, a boxer, a stunt pilot, a test pilot, an engineer. He held a doctorate from MIT, yet he was also the kind of man who would climb into a cockpit and push an aircraft past its limits just to understand what it could do, and he was fearless. Just 2 years earlier, he had led the famous Doolittle Raid, the audacious strike in which 16 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier to hit Tokyo in 1942. It was the mission nobody thought possible. It didn't win the war, but it proved that America could strike back. For that, he received the Medal of Honor. Now he had been given another impossible task: break the Luftwaffe or lose the war. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, had made it painfully clear in late 1943, if we don't destroy the German Air Force, we cannot invade Europe. So when Doolittle arrived in England, he wasted no time. He walked straight into the heart of the problem, the fighter doctrine that treated P-51s and P-47s like flying bodyguards. To Doolittle, this was madness. Fighters weren't shields, they were weapons. If they stayed chained to the bombers, the Germans would always choose when and where to attack. The Luftwaffe would survive, the bombing campaign would choke, the invasion of France would become a slaughter before it even began. So on his first full day in command, Doolittle rewrote the rules. His new order was brutal in its simplicity. Fighters would no longer fly close escort. They would range out ahead of the bombers, hunting German aircraft wherever they formed. They would pursue and destroy, not just defend. And once the bombers turned home, the fighters would stay behind to strafe airfields, fuel depots, and rail lines, crushing the Luftwaffe on the ground as well as in the air. It was a complete reversal of everything the 8th Air Force had been doing. It was bold, it was ruthless, and it changed the war. Doolittle's new fighter directive spread through the 8th Air Force like a tremor. Some called it visionary, others called it insane. Fighter pilots, especially the aggressive ones, understood instantly. This was the fight they had been waiting for. No more circling helplessly near bomber formations. No more watching German fighters dive in, strike, and disappear out of reach. Now they had permission to do what fighters were built to do: hunt. Colonel Don Blakesley, the hard-edged commander of the 4th Fighter Group, gathered his squadron and didn't sugarcoat it. Gentlemen, we're not babysitters anymore. We're killers. We're going to find the Luftwaffe and wipe them out. But bomber crews saw it differently. To them, this wasn't strategy. It was betrayal. For 2 years, they had flown into German flak and fighters with only the promise that their escorts would protect them. Now those escorts were being ordered to leave. The men who flew the Flying Fortresses and Liberators began writing letters home saying they felt abandoned, sent to die without cover. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Howard, a fighter ace who would later earn the Medal of Honor for single-handedly defending a bomber formation, understood both sides, greater than, "The bomber boys think we've gone mad. They see us pull away and think we're leaving them to die, but we're not abandoning them. We're saving them before the Germans ever reach them." In briefings, eyes rolled. Voices were raised. Squadron leaders argued. Some officers threatened to ignore the order. But Doolittle was unmoved. He knew wars weren't won by playing defense. His directive would stand. Now it needed to be tested in combat. Winter storms kept the bombers grounded through much of January 1944, delaying the first trial of Doolittle's new orders. But on January 29th, the skies finally opened, and with them came a chance to prove or destroy Doolittle's strategy. That morning, more than 800 American bombers roared toward Frankfurt, high above and ahead of them, flying loose instead of tight, sweeping arcs across the sky instead of hovering close, were the P-51 Mustangs of the 357 fighter group. They weren't escorting anymore. They were hunting. Near Bonn, the Mustangs spotted their prey, 50 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, forming up for an attack run on the bombers. Under the old doctrine, the Mustangs would have stayed close to the bombers and waited to repel the strike. But not today. The American fighters rolled over and dived. They hit the Germans from above with speed, surprise, and altitude, everything a fighter pilot dreams of and a bomber never had. The Luftwaffe pilots were caught completely off guard. They came expecting vulnerable bombers. Instead, they were ambushed by faster, fresher fighters who chose the fight before it even began. In less than 8 minutes, the battle was over. 13 German fighters destroyed. 0 bombers lost to that attack. 2 Mustangs damaged, but both made it home. Elsewhere that same day, Colonel Don Blakesley and the 4th Fighter Group pounced on a formation of slow-climbing FW-190s near Cologne. Loaded with ammunition and fuel, the Germans never had a chance. Greater than they were heavy and struggling to climb, Blakesley wrote later. We came screaming down on them. It wasn't a dogfight, it was a harvest. 11 more German fighters destroyed, and once again, no bombers lost. For the men watching from inside the bomber formations, something strange and incredible happened that day. The German attacks never came. The Luftwaffe wasn't gone, far from it, but for the first time in the war, American bombers reached a major German target without being torn apart. Doolittle's gamble had drawn blood, and the real offensive was just beginning. If January 29th was a warning shot, February 1944 was the opening of a full-scale aerial war. The operation was officially called Operation Argument, but every man who flew it would remember it by a different name, Big Week. The plan, conceived by General Karl Spaatz, was brutal and brilliant. American bombers would launch massive strikes, not against cities, not against morale, but against the heart of Germany's fighter production, aircraft factories, engine plants, assembly facilities. The goal wasn't just to destroy buildings. It was to force the Luftwaffe to fight. For days, the weather had trapped both sides on the ground. But on February 20th, 1944, the skies over Germany cleared and Big Week began. More than 1,000 bombers from England and Italy took off. Hundreds of fighters, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings, flew with them. The largest air assault in history had begun, and the Germans knew they couldn't ignore it. They came up to fight. Nearly 900 Luftwaffe fighters scrambled to intercept the Americans. The air over central Germany dissolved into chaos. Contrails tangled like white scars against the sky. Explosions flashed in the cold air. Radio chatter turned to screams. But this time, unlike Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the American fighters weren't trapped behind the bombers. They were everywhere. They didn't wait for German formations to attack. They smashed into them, above cities, over forests, over airfields, over factory towns, at takeoff, at landing, in formation, scattered. It didn't matter. The Mustangs hunted them all. On the very first day, American losses, 21 bombers, 4 fighters. German losses, over 50 fighters destroyed, but worse, they lost 38 experienced pilots, and that was just the beginning. For 6 days, whenever weather allowed, the bombers came. Brunswick, Gotha, Steyr, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, again. Every mission was a trap, and the Luftwaffe had no choice but to fly into it. By the end of Big Week, 226 American bombers lost, 28 American fighters lost, over 350 German fighters destroyed, nearly 100 German pilots killed, most of them veterans. Men like Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's top aces, saw the truth long before German command would admit it. We shoot down bombers, yes, but the fighters are everywhere. We land and they strafe the runway. We form up, and they pounce. There is no escape. Big Week didn't just hurt the Luftwaffe, it broke their spine. Big Week shattered the illusion that the Luftwaffe could still control the skies. But Doolittle wasn't interested in winning a single operation. He wanted total annihilation of German air power. That required a second phase. No sanctuary, no survival. Under Doolittle's orders, escort missions transformed into search and destroy operations. Every American fighter pilot now had two missions. 1. Eliminate German aircraft in the air. 2. Destroy their ability to fly on the ground. When bombers turned for home, fighters no longer followed. Instead, they dropped to treetop level and began ripping apart Germany's air infrastructure. They hit airfields, parked aircraft, fuel depots, ammunition trains, hangars and maintenance sheds, runways, chewed apart with .50 caliber fire. Day after day, squadrons of Mustangs and Thunderbolts streaked across Germany, machine guns blazing, kicking up dirt, fire, and wreckage in their wake. It wasn't glamorous high-altitude combat anymore. It was grimy, personal, and deadly. German pilots who survived dogfights now died while landing. Mechanics died servicing aircraft. Fuel truck crews burned alive. Every moment of every day, every German airman was now in danger. Major Gunther Rahl, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, described the nightmare. We used to feel safe when we reached our own airfields. Now we fear landing more than combat. The Americans attack morning, noon, and night. Nowhere is safe. This was no longer a fight for air superiority. This was extermination. And by March 1944, the effects began to show. When the 8th Air Force launched its first massive raid on Berlin, the heart of Germany, something incredible happened. The Luftwaffe showed up and lost more planes than they had in any single air battle before. Doolittle's hunters were closing in. By the spring of 1944, the once feared Luftwaffe was beginning to unravel, not because Germany ran out of planes, it ran out of pilots. Germany still produced fighters in staggering numbers, over 1,000 aircraft a month, but factories don't win wars, pilots do, and the Luftwaffe was losing them faster than they could be replaced. The numbers told a story of slow death. January to May 1944, over 1,000 German fighter pilots killed, wounded, or missing. Nearly a quarter of Germany's fighter force, gone worse. These weren't rookies. They were veterans, squadron leaders, instructors, the best Germany had left. Why? Because the Luftwaffe had a fatal flaw. Experienced pilots led from the front, flying every mission, while rookies with barely 100 hours of training, and sometimes as little as 50, were thrown straight into combat. Many died on their first or second mission. German pilot Hans Dammers wrote to his brother, "The new boys last 3, maybe 4 missions. They do not know how to fight. They panic. They die. And with them, Germany dies a little more." Meanwhile, American pilots flew into combat with 4 times more training, and they were fighting over Germany's own skies, where every loss hit the enemy twice, a destroyed plane and a dead pilot. Then came March 6, 1944, the day the Luftwaffe broke. The U.S. Army Air Forces launched 730 bombers and over 800 fighters against Berlin. The target didn't matter. The message did. There is nowhere left to hide. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the battle. Over 150 German fighters attacked. They fought with desperation, but desperation doesn't win wars. When the smoke cleared, 69 American bombers destroyed, 11 American fighters lost, 160 German fighters destroyed, 70 German pilots lost in one day. Squadron Commander Johannes Wiese wrote that night, "Today, I watch the German fighter arm die. The Americans shoot us down faster than we can shoot them down. Our losses cannot be replaced. The war is lost." He was right. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, but in the skies, it was already dead. By April 1944, the transformation was undeniable. Just 6 months earlier, bombers had been torn apart in German airspace. Now the Luftwaffe was losing control of its own skies. Squadron by squadron, airfield by airfield, the German fighter force was being hunted to extinction. Fuel shortages grounded entire units. Fresh pilots arrived with shaky hands and almost no training. Radar stations were destroyed.
command networks broke down, and everywhere the German fighters turned, the Mustangs were already there. Then came the day that proved the Luftwaffe was finished. May 8th, 1944. 8th Air Force launched nearly 900 bombers with over 750 escort fighters deep into Germany. Not a single German interceptor rose to attack. Not one. General Adolf Galland, head of German fighter forces, sent a grim message to Goering afterward. "The fighter arm is finished. We still have aircraft, but no fuel, no experienced pilots, and no chance of stopping the enemy." For the first time since 1939, Germany no longer controlled its own airspace. The sky belonged to the Americans, and just in time, because 1 month later, on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history would begin, D-Day. On that morning, over 14,000 Allied aircraft filled the skies over Normandy. Fighters strafed German convoys. P-47 Thunderbolts shredded coastal artillery. Bombers smashed rail lines and troop movements. Airborne divisions dropped behind enemy lines, without interference from German aircraft. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties that day, almost none near the landing zones. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sent a message to his wife 3 days after the invasion began. "The enemy has complete air superiority. Our troops cannot move. Our supplies cannot reach the front. Without air cover, we cannot hold D-Day did not succeed because of numbers alone, or tanks, or ships, or generals. It succeeded because the Luftwaffe was gone." Jimmy Doolittle's order had cleared the skies of Europe. History would look back at Doolittle's directive and call it bold, aggressive, even ruthless. But it was also mathematically perfect. Here's why his strategy succeeded where years of bombing had failed. 1. It seized the initiative under the old escort tactics. American fighters were reactive, waiting for the Luftwaffe to attack first. That handed control of every battle to the Germans. Doolittle flipped the equation. Greater than offense replaced defense. American fighters no longer waited. They struck first, on their terms, choosing when and where to fight. 2. It targeted the real weakness bombing factories hurt production, but it didn't stop the Luftwaffe from flying. Germany could replace planes. But what it couldn't replace fast enough were experienced pilots. Doolittle's fighters attacked the true center of gravity, German pilots. 3. It used bombers as bait. This sounds brutal, but it worked. Big formation raids forced the Luftwaffe to respond. When German fighters rose to intercept the bombers, American Mustangs were already in position, waiting to tear into them. The bombers drew them in. The fighters finished them. 4. It attacked everywhere no more front lines, no more safe zones. In the air, at takeoff, during landing, on the ground, in hangars, on supply trains. Nowhere was safe. This round-the-clock pressure crippled German squadrons, shattered morale, and destroyed fuel, aircraft, and men faster than they could be replaced. 5. It turned the Luftwaffe into the hunted by May 1944. The psychological shift was complete. At the start of the war, American bomber crews feared German fighters. By mid-1944, German pilots feared American fighters. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group said it best. "In January, we were grateful when the Germans didn't attack. By March, we were disappointed when they ran. By May, we were angry because there were so few left to fight." Air superiority wasn't won by defending bombers. It was won by destroying fighters. And that idea, the brutal simplicity of it, became the foundation of modern air strategy. The strategy worked. But victory came at a price written in blood across the skies of Europe. Between January and June of 1944 alone, over 10,000 American airmen were killed. More than 400 American fighter pilots died carrying out Doolittle's offensive. The 8th Air Force would suffer more casualties than the entire U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. For bomber crews, every mission was a gamble with death. Engines caught fire. Men froze in open winds at 25,000 feet. Parachutes failed. Gunners watched friends disappear in explosions without a trace. On some missions, over half the men never returned. For fighter pilots, the hunt was merciless and personal. The life expectancy of new arrivals was measured in weeks. Those who survived learned fast or died faster. They chased enemies through flak clouds, strafed airfields at treetop level, and landed on shot-up runways with bullet holes in their wings and oil burning on their boots. And yet they kept flying, because they knew one truth: if they didn't win control of the skies, the war would never end. The Germans paid even more. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,500 fighter pilots killed or wounded. 75% of Germany's frontline fighter force was wiped out. Entire squadrons disappeared. Germany began graduating pilots with just 50 to 100 hours of flight time, barely enough to fly, much less fight. Veteran German ace Major Hans Philipp wrote in despair shortly before his death, "The boys who come to us now are children. They do not last. We train them as best we can, but training takes time. Time is something we no longer have." One by one, the great German aces fell: Graf, Nowotny, Wick, Stengler, Hrabak. Some were shot down. Some ran out of ammo and rammed bombers in suicide attacks. Most simply disappeared into the smoke and chaos of combat. Germany still built planes, but had no one left to fly them. By the summer of 1944, the air over Europe had changed forever. The Luftwaffe, the force that once terrorized the continent, was broken, not by bombing cities, not by destroying factories, not by outproducing the enemy. It was destroyed by a single, brutal idea: the best defense is to destroy the enemy first. Jimmy Doolittle understood what few dared to believe. Air superiority isn't won by shielding bombers. It isn't won by waiting. It isn't won by fear. It is won by striking first, striking deep, and never letting the enemy recover. Between January and December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 4,000 fighter pilots. German aircraft losses in air combat passed 11,000. Pilot experience collapsed from 200 hours to under 50. The kill ratio flipped from Germany's favor in 1943 to 7-1 in favor of the Allies by 1945. Doolittle didn't just give new orders. He changed the very purpose of fighters in modern war. He turned escorts into hunters. He turned defense into destruction. He gave bombers their protection not by staying close, but by clearing the skies ahead of them. Years later, he reflected simply, "You cannot win by defending. You win by attacking today." His strategy is still studied in every Air Force academy in the world, because it worked, because it changed everything, because it turned the tide of World War II. The original sign that hung in General Kepner's office now sits in a museum, its message a relic of a lost doctrine.
The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Next to it hangs the sign Doolittle replaced it with, 6 words that broke the Luftwaffe and won control of Europe's skies. The first duty of fighters is to destroy enemy fighters, and they did.